part two with Sam from Sunlight Realty. Sam, it looks like you got a post-COVID haircut. The woolly mammoth treatment is gone for good. I thought the
no longer looking like Chewbacca, so I'm good with that.
Chewbacca. That's always a good analogy. So, all right. So 2 topics I wanted to cover today. We got great feedback on last week's video. I know we had a few people call our office based on it, and it sounds like you may have gotten someone that is interested in either buying or selling a commercial property. So I'm glad this video format is working and we're getting good content and educational information out to folks. Yeah. So today we have 2 topics. One is landlord-tenant issues that are either arising or needing to be dealt with during COVID. Then the second issue is going to be always fun, speculation on values post-COVID. I have heard a number of things, but I am not an expert and not nearly as tied into the market as you. So I am interested to hear what your thoughts are. You know, people that are looking to buy, should they be waiting in hopes that the prices are going to go down? If you're selling, should you be trying to sell before those prices go down? Sure. Or are the prices going to weather the storm and continue? So we'll start with first is first. Right now, I am under the impression, and I think what we get from the news is that on the county and even state level, with respect to landlord tenants, that there has been a moratorium on evictions. I know the courts, to a large extent, we're hearing are shut down and not hearing foreclosure actions. What of that is accurate, and how can you expand on that topic?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, one of the blessings is we haven't had to file any evictions for any of the properties that we're participating in, which is fantastic news. And that's both on the commercial and the residential side. We have 100% payment rate right now of all rents. Now, we did have to remain flexible on some of those terms because, you know, some people are affected more than others. But, you know, the thing about this whole thing is that there is no textbook answer for this, okay? Nobody wrote a textbook about how to do landlord-tenant relations during a pandemic. That being said, there are a few things that we did, and I call them the 3 commandments of landlording during COVID. The first one is communication. Communication is so important. In the very beginning of this whole COVID thing, we started hearing on the news, you know, tenants should not pay their rent. You know, there's going to be a stay of execution in the way of evictions. And while the governor did do an executive order, and the Supreme Court of Florida also said that they were going to put a moratorium on the actual eviction process, that's only temporary. The virus is temporary, and the stay of execution, if you would call it, on the evictions is somewhat temporary. And also, I think most people don't realize what the ramifications of those of an eviction may be. So the first thing I suggest to everybody, landlord and tenant, is communicate. When we started hearing the news media start throwing around the idea that tenants didn't have to pay their rent and landlords didn't have to pay their mortgages, and that's a recipe for disaster. So the first thing that we did is we wrote all of our tenants a letter. Okay, and the letter basically said something to the effect like, "Look, we're all in this together. We understand that you may be facing some situations. We're going to try and remain as flexible as possible to try and help accommodate for those types of situations, and try and solve the problem together." You know, everybody has to realize landlording is a business and it needs to be treated that way. And with any good business, you need good communications between you and your customer. So a landlord's job is to provide quality housing or quality commercial space for their tenants. And of course, the tenant's responsibility includes paying their rent on time. So part of that communication process that we put out there was, hey, if you run into problems, call us first. Let us know right away if you're facing any kind of concern or issue, job loss, illness, whatever it may be, let us know right away. Don't leave it to the last minute until you miss a rent payment or anything along those lines. Let us know. We'll do our very best to work with you. Now, the other thing is, the second commandment is remaining flexible. A lot of flexibility has to deal with how you handle these types of situations that come in. For example, in our situation, we had one tenant who was a fairly new tenant. She had just moved into the property, and we found out that, hey, you know, she's working in a place where they were unable to supply personal protective equipment. She was compromised in the way of immunity, as well as her child. So she was very concerned that, hey, if I go to the work and I come home and I bring this back to either myself or my child, we're going to have a very serious issue. So 2 weeks after moving in, she ended up quitting her job. Now, of course, as a landlord, you're very concerned about these types of things, but she did communicate it to us. She did eventually find a job. We worked with her on the rent. She prepaid the rent, some of the stimulus money that had come in. So we're in a good spot there. On the commercial side, in one of our retail operations, and retail has taken a very big part of the brunt of this. Retail, hospitality and leisure, restaurants, all of these places have been affected dramatically. So if you're a commercial tenant, like a restaurant tenant in a freestanding building, for example, your commercial landlord is going to have some very serious problems if you're unable to secure either PPP funding or other types of, there's an emergency distress loan that's available. So if you were unable to secure those, a lot of restaurants, a lot of single tenants, they're not keeping 6 to 12 months of reserves in the bank. They probably should. I mean, that's one of the, that actually leads us into commandment number 3, which is learn from this situation. But remaining flexible, you also have to remember that you have to have a bona fide issue. So, we trust but verify everything. So if somebody says, hey, I lost a job or whatever, okay, show me what your plan is here. Commercial tenants, you're going to know whether or not they have, cars in the parking lot or not. A lot of these sit-down restaurants, we're not prepared for dine-in. I heard the other day that some of these very high-end restaurants, they're actually getting their food for takeout. Now, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been to Burn's Steakhouse to get takeout, but I mean, when you think about it, these places that are dine-in only, they're suffering the worst when it comes to, patronage, if you can't do that. The other thing that I notice here is that in the restaurants particularly, is that now that this phase 2 opening in Florida is going on, they're limited to 25% seating capacity. Well, if your restaurant if it requires a 50% occupancy in order just to break even, you've got some financial challenges ahead of you. So we're trying to remain flexible on the landlord side as much as possible to try and accommodate that. Now, the third commandment is learn, okay? This is such an unusual situation. People are learning on the fly. One of the main takeaways I think everybody should learn is that we as Americans have gotten very complacent, okay? We're not saving, and we really need to have some kind of rainy day fund, both as a tenant and as a landlord. And just as an individual or a business, you have to maintain some kind of savings, because that rainy day fund is going to give you flexibility. It's going to give you resilience and the ability to withstand these types of problems. Keep in mind that they're projecting right now that there is potentially a second wave of this maybe coming in the fall time. Unknown. A lot of the projections, fortunately, have been wrong. A lot of the doom and gloom original projections have not come to fruition, and we should all be very thankful for that. But it is something to now be cognizant of as we move forward, that you should be bolstering your cash positions. If you're a landlord, for example, and you have non-performing assets, you may want to consider exiting some of those assets and raising cash just to be able to withstand another wave of this if that happens. That's primarily, I would say that if I were to take anything out of that, the first thing that I would suggest is communication. If you have not communicated with your tenants, or if you're a tenant and you've not communicated with your landlord, now is the time. Don't wait. One of the things that we did was to, during this hysterical time, everybody's having this, the media is peddling as much fear as possible. They're pumping it into all of us. They want us scared. I don't know why. I guess it just sells the headlines. But all of us need to kind of keep our head about us, okay? And the thing that we need to be cognizant of is that as a landlord, our obligation is to provide a quality, safe living environment or commercial environment for our tenants. And the tenant's obligation is to pay the rent on time, every time. Now, we understand that there may be some issues in dealing with that during this type of situation, but at the end of the day, reminding ourselves of where things are and what that relationship truly is something that we can all benefit from. The last thing anybody wants to do is to go through an eviction process. And even while the evictions, there may be a stay on ejection of actually removing them, having the marshal show up and remove their stuff and the people from the property. That is only temporary. From my understanding, the courts are still going through the process of the eviction up to the point of ejection. So what you might want to consider is if you're facing that kind of scenario as a landlord, and you have people that are they cannot pay, you may want to consider releasing them from the lease. If that's within reason, it's probably cheaper than going through the eviction process. And also cash for keys is another option. These types of situations say, look, you can get on your way, we'll release you. We won't go through the eviction process, but you have to move out and not destroy your place on the way out. Those are a couple of different ways that you can handle that kind of scenario. That each situation is different, but those are options that you may want to consider in dealing with this kind of situation as things stand right now. Now that's on the landlord-tenant side of things, okay? And as we progress, the impact that we're going to see overall market-wise is going to be based on the duration of the lockdowns. Now, and I'm going to kind of talk about what the trends are that we're looking at to kind of gauge where things are going to go. Everybody wants to know, what's my house value going to do? What's my commercial property value going to do? And, the equations have changed a little bit. They've injected a couple different things into the equation that we now need to consider in the risk profile. So,
Sam, before we get into the speculation, I wanted to follow up on a couple of points. I love the communication piece, because I think it all starts with that. Right now with a lot of people out of work, if you're a landlord, there may not be a bunch of people chomping at the bit to move into your property. So even if you throw someone out, if you could, there may not be a long list of people that have the funds to move in and pay the first and last month in security deposit. So working with what you have and trying to kind of negotiate something that's workable for both parties, I think is always the best scenario, but certainly at these times. And then, at the end of the day, everything needs to be trued up. Maybe I'm not using the term properly, but whether it's the mortgage companies that are not foreclosing, whether it's landlords that are not evicting,
the bill's going to come due.
Yeah, it's at some point. I don't know of any strategy that's workable that just says, like, we'll just pretend the last X number of months didn't happen. You don't pay us. You never owe us, and we'll just pick it back up when things go back to normal, and we'll just kind of forget about that bad time. I'm sure that the tenants would love that, and
sure, but that's not realistic.
Mortgage company would love it. But what are your thoughts on? I mean, I guess there's some creativity of, let them pay it on the end if it's a mortgage, but if it's in a lease scenario, you may not have to pay it at the end. Maybe increase it a little bit over time so that it trues itself up by the end of the lease. What are your thoughts on how to make the true up work?
There's a couple of strategies that we've employed. One is one of the tenants had said, hey, look, I can pay half now and half in mid-month. Okay. That kind of helps their cash flow to try and get through this process. That is fine. We were able to accept that. They've been paying along those lines, which is also an option. Another option is to reduce the rent. Now, we're not talking substantial reductions, but you may be looking at 10 or 15, 20%. But specifically about that is that the agreement needs to be made in writing at that time to say, okay, we're going to defer, let's say, 100 or 200, whatever the number is, $100, $200, whatever it is. But it has to be paid over the course of the remaining life of your lease. So that's another way that you can try and defer it into the future. But I will advise every landlord that the answer is never to charge zero, because you have a psychological barrier when a tenant hears zero, no matter how quality of a tenant they are. It's a psychological barrier in your mind where, it's a lot harder to catch up after zero than it is, let's say, a reduction of a few $100s a month, for example. No. You're putting them almost behind the 8 ball where they can't recover. So I would definitely never advise that particular measure. Never a $0 amount. Everybody's got to pay something.
Perfect. Our next topic is kind of near and dear to my heart because I am in the process of buying another residential property for an investment. And, I'm actually waiting right now on the appraisal to come in. And I'm a little bit, I don't want to say nervous, but I'm a little bit, I guess, concerned of appraisals always, in my mind, seem to look at past historical sales. And since the market was relatively good up until a short period ago, what does it look like? Is my appraisal going to be accurate now? Because things just kind of in the last 6 to 8 weeks have gone wacky. There may not have been a lot of sales in the 6 to 8 weeks to get comps on. And so is my appraisal likely going to come in higher than what really the true value as it sits today? And then secondly, if I extend the negotiations for the next 60 or 90 days, does that maybe buy me some downward trajectory on what I'm going to be paying for this property? The last thing I want to do is pay historical good market value and then find myself in 90 days, 120 days with a property that's lost 20 to 30%, and I'm out $100,000 or more on timing. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a big question. So let me kind of tackle it this way. Real estate demand is based on one of two components, people and money. Okay. So here's the good news. The good news is the demand is still there. One thing that we have to keep in perspective is that we live in an area, this whole Tampa Bay market, the I-4 corridor represents about 30% of Florida's population, but it's 36% of the growth. We have, on average, 300,000 people moving into the state every year. Now, that's roughly the equivalent size of the city of Orlando. We're adding that kind of population every year for roughly the past 10 years. So what you really need to kind of think about here is you have plenty of demand that's out there. That demand has not gone away. That demand is still there. It's just that it's pent up. And we've had 2 listings recently, just as an example, in the past couple of days, which we put on what we consider to be a premium price. And the first property had 24 showings scheduled in the first 24 hours.
Wow.
It was, I mean, we put it on, we got over asking price on the property, and we had 12 offers. That's just one property. We had another property that it didn't even hit the market, didn't even get to that point yet. We already had a buyer for the property. Again, full asking price, couple minor concessions. The bottom line is that appraisals are only an opinion of value based on one point in time. So when people are concerned about these things, let's say that you're buying a property today and you're buying it as an investment. Really what you need to be buying it on is based on what the cash flow looks like, okay? Is it going to make you the ROI? Are the rents remaining the same? And then when you're trying to analyze that, the big thing that you need to look at is, what is the demand? Is the demand still there? In 2008, 2009, after we experienced the last crash, what you saw was a massive unemployment, long-term unemployment. And with that unemployment comes a lot of sellers entering into the market, okay? And they had also built a massive oversupply at that time. Now, supply and demand are in rough equilibrium in Florida right now. Matter of fact, I would even suggest to say at this point, based on what we see on the street every day, is that we have more demand than we have supply. That's still the case. That's still what our experience is, even during this 8-week period of COVID. We still have plenty of people that are looking. There's a lot of people that are looking. A lot of people have hit the pause button. Don't get me wrong. A lot of sellers and a lot of buyers have said, hey, I want to wait until this whole thing is kind of settled out and see where things go. And that's great. All right. But what I would be looking at for your perspective, for example, is if you're trying to measure, hey, look, should I wait? Should I not wait? I would never recommend to any client to try and time the market. The market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. That's usually that's the way they usually put it.
Stocks work.
And it's a fact. And I was looking at the unemployment numbers today, and the unemployment numbers on a national basis are over 14%. But in Florida, based on March's numbers, we were at a little over 4%. Now, granted, some of that unemployment is hitting certain markets much harder than others.
Sure.
For example, surprisingly, medical has been negatively affected. You would think that most doctors, hey, I mean, everybody needs medicine all the time, right? Well, yes, that's true up to the point where you have what they call elective surgeries or elective procedures. So dentists and stuff like that are having a harder time. And then if you're going in for an elective procedure, guess what? The doctors, the RNs are kind of sitting there and there's not a lot of action going on there.
Yeah.
So, and the whole COVID thing is also causing a lot of fear to keep people away from the hospitals. So that's been an interesting caveat to it. Of course, retail and restaurants. So if you're a waiter or a bartender, guess what? You've been out of work for 8 weeks, and there's will it come back? Of course, it's going to come back over time. But the question is, how long will it take? So you're asking me, Sam, are the property values going up? Or are they going down? Or what's going to happen? And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. But the way that I did hear it explained to me, which I think makes a lot of sense, is COVID is a medical situation. Okay, it's a medical problem. And when a medical solution comes up where we have a tried and true treatment plan, you're going to see normalcy return to the market. But it's not just that. What's so interesting about this scenario right now is that the pent-up demand has not stopped. It's just sitting there and it's growing. And every week it's growing and it's growing. And keep in mind, you've got all these people, they're not accustomed to being home as much as they are, not as accustomed to being as close to their spouses or their kids or their barking dogs. You know what I mean? They're trying to work from home and they're trying to educate their kids from home. You're going to see lots of people kind of busting at the seams in the way of the housing market. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to see people buying larger homes. And we are beginning to see some of the emotional reaction to that and trying to get out as we open up. People are starting to shop again. They want to get out. They need to get out. They need to increase. A lot of them are choosing larger homes as a result of that. I will make one other point about, there's a couple of interesting trends that we're watching. The first thing is population density. That's all of a sudden become a liability. With the whole COVID thing, most people hadn't really thought about that until you look at New York City, okay? If you're in a tiny piece of land with tens of millions of people, and you are worried about a disease that's potentially airborne, a lot of people want to get out of the cities. It remains to be seen whether or not people get accustomed to living with the risk, or if there is actually a true, I wouldn't call it an exodus, but a lot of people are going to decide that, hey, you know what, suburbia might be a better choice for me, or the people in suburbia may end up going to a more rural location. We are beginning to see that trend. That may not be a long-term trend. We're kind of waiting to see that. And then there's one other thing that we need to kind of consider in our risk factor right now, on the investment side, as well as where we live and where we work. And that is the thought of governmental risk. We all understand physical risk. Does it have a roof that's going to collapse? We understand economic risk. Is this in a zone that's, affluent or non-affluent? But there's another thing that we have to look at that's called governmental risk. And the governmental risk comes as a result of how this whole COVID thing has been reacted to. Hillsborough County, for example, they have gone through a little bit more of their lockdowns have been a little bit more stringent than Pasco, for example. So we do expect that if restaurants and businesses remain closed in Hillsborough longer, you may have people in Hillsborough say, hey, look, this is no longer a business-friendly community. We can't afford to maintain operations in these areas. We may try and find something more friendly. We'll put it that way. We are already seeing that trend in what we see inside the United States, where you see a lot of the northeastern states are losing population. They're coming to states like Florida and Texas. And of course, on the west coast of Florida, where we are in Tampa, we see a lot of people coming in from Ohio and Michigan. And that's always kind of been that way. But I think you're going to see more of that because you have overtaxation and overregulation, especially in Michigan. I noticed that their lockdowns are much longer than what they are here. And I mean, look, if you have the ability to vote with your feet, a lot of people are doing that right now. So,
well, I was just watching the other day, Elon Musk got into it in California, threatened to move his operations. And then I don't know if it was a city council or someone up in the government tweeted what I thought was really interesting. Elon
Yeah,
Musk.
Elon Musk. Yeah, I think that was
Oh,
a
wow,
city
that is
council person in Los Angeles or San Diego.
a line in the sand, and now I guess the ball's in his court of whether he's going to put up or shut up and actually move his operations. But yeah, I definitely see that the government in different states, different counties are moving things around. One other topic I kind of wanted to, it's a related topic. We obviously have the technology to work remotely, and
Mhm.
with more people able to work from home, that could potentially affect the commercial space because businesses may be able to function in a smaller physical footprint.
Footprint. Yep.
And I think prior to COVID, a lot of people, some progressive companies were testing it and they were letting some people work from home. But I think a lot of the business owners were concerned about productivity and
Of course.
you can't walk into your employee's office and see that they're not playing on Facebook when they're supposed to be working. They got nervous, but now that everybody's been forced to do it, I feel like I've heard from other business owners and out in the community that overall they haven't seen a tank in productivity. And in fact, in some cases, they've seen more productivity. They've seen their employees, well, wage and hour could be a separate issue, but they're seeing their employees sending emails at 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night.
Right.
Whereas, so yeah, maybe they take an extra break during the day, but they're certainly not checking out at 5 for their commute home.
Right.
And quite often you can, as a business owner, you can even pay your employees less to work from home because they don't have potentially all the wardrobe expenses and the commuting expenses. And if you're in a large industrial or metropolitan area, I mean, even parking, New York City can be
Yeah.
$100 a day to park your car if you were dumb enough to drive a car, I guess, in the city to work. But even in Tampa, 717 parking is making a boatload of money in downtown Tampa on all the people that drive downtown to go to work. So do you think, again, speculation, but do you think that you might start seeing businesses try to get more efficient, work in a smaller space, allow the telecommuting and the offsite work? And do you think that may negatively impact commercial prices in the future with more supply, I guess?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, there's a couple ways to look at that. And you're absolutely right. It's an excellent observation. Imagine that you're on Madison Avenue in New York City and you take 3 floors of a large skyscraper there. What do you think the real estate prices are for that kind of space?
Millions a month.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say that you can have 10% of that footprint, but maintain the same workforce and the same or greater productivity just by keeping your employees at home. I mean, that's definitely going to put some downward pressure, especially in the larger cities. I do expect that to happen. Another interesting area that we're going to see some pressure is in the academia market. Your colleges. You have these massive facilities, and you have a ton of people that are involved in operating these things. But unfortunately, if your classes aren't there, and you're in the student housing market, for example, well, guess what? A lot of those places, they're empty. And there's really, unless you repurpose it for normal everyday rents, I think you're going to see downward pressure on tuition prices as a result of that, because they just don't need. I mean, you're going to be competing. You're almost on an equal footing now with Harvard versus FSU, for example. Because you can attend a class just as easily in either one of those 2 campuses simply by turning on your webcam. So I think that's going to there's going to be a lot of efficiency engineering, not only in business, but you're also going to see it in retail as well. I mean, you're already seeing it. The Amazon effect is a well-known effect that's putting tons of retailers out of business. We're starting to see Walmart is trying to compete with that. They're trying to do, they're trying to do the pickup and the online ordering, and they may be a little bit behind the 8 ball on that. But the retail overall, a very interesting thing I read this morning was they're expecting 100 million square feet of retail to go dark this year in the next 12 months. And that's as a result of companies like JCPenney and Neiman Marcus and a number of these companies that are missing payments and closing stores. I just read today that the parent company of Bells is filing for bankruptcy. Yes, I mean, these are major companies that we're talking about with huge footprints. And when they're going to close, I mean, remember when Sears went out of business, for example? It's they closed down all those stores. Now you have these big gaping holes in malls. So the mall, I think if you're looking at a mall, I'd be very concerned, especially if you're a tenant in a mall and you're counting on these anchors to bring the foot traffic in. If you're depending on that foot traffic, that's going to be kind of an interesting situation, unfortunately. Yeah. So I think we're going to see some very major and permanent changes as a result of what COVID has brought upon us. And there's one other thing that is interesting, and I don't know why a lot of people don't talk about it, but you're in the senior market. We have 80 million people in this country that are retiring. They're growing over 65, and they're starting to draw down on their assets. They're starting to sell a lot of their assets. And the question mark has been, well, are the generations that are coming behind them sufficiently wealthy to absorb those assets at current market prices? And that's a big question, and we don't know the answer to that. The Gen Xers, for example, is a smaller generation than the Boomers. So they're the ones that are poised to to start acquiring some of these assets. But if there's not sufficient funds available to do that, you may see downward pressure overall. That being said, the Fed, remember, if we go back to the original demand for real estate, we were talking people plus money. People, okay, if the number of people behind the Boomers are not as large, for example, well, the Fed is definitely doing a lot to inject an awful lot of money and keep those interest rates very artificially low. And let's face it, some of the treasury bonds and stuff have gone to negative rates. Now, whether they stay there or not, I don't know, but you have trillions of dollars sloshing around over in Europe that are at negative interest rates right now. So sure. It's going to be very interesting to see economically what happens. The great part is, and I think everybody in Tampa needs to kind of remember this, we live in one of the fastest growing areas of the country. People are moving here more than they're moving away. That's good for us. That's going to give us a lot more economic stability than, let's say, Rochester, New York, for example. These industrial age era cities that are declining. People are not staying there. Originally, I'm from Connecticut. Not a lot of people want to stay in Connecticut. People are moving out. The opportunity is not there for younger people, and for the older people, it's a very difficult place to retire in. So, these are the types of trends that are happening right now. I would definitely keep an eye on the unemployment rate. I would say at this point, I still believe that especially the Florida market the future is very bright. Once we get past this, things are going to be, that pent-up demand is going to be released, and it's going to be a very, very interesting time to own property in Florida.
I think so. So Sam, I just put your wife's comment on there. At least we know she's watching, and she's supporting you. So Winnie, thank you for watching. We appreciate that. So a couple things that kind of made me think of that is on the malls. We've been talking about in the senior industry for years that malls are on their way out. There's no question. There's going to be boutique stores. People will go to Louis. People will go to Gucci store to buy their products because they're a high-end retailer. Their margins are great and they'll survive. But the Macy's and the Dillards and all of those places, the Sears, obviously, we've already seen go by the wayside. There's been a lot of talk of developers, instead of just tearing down a mall, the structures are solid, they're good, turning them into senior housing. Sure. It wouldn't be a horrible idea, or probably incredibly difficult, to just gut it and then turn them all into apartments with an atrium or something. It could really work, and I think that will help a lot of the folks. The other thing on the residential side, we're seeing a lot of our clients who are hesitant to move into senior living. And I think it's across the country because they're afraid COVID's going to get into the facility and it's going to be a ground for risk. And so I think when this clears up, whether it's by some miracle of a vaccine or a cure, or whether it's just slowly over time when people come to grips with it, I think we're going to see a lot more properties go on the market in the retail space for residential, because quite often it's a 1-2 combination. My seniors will find a suitable senior community, independent living, assisted, memory care, or skilled nursing.
Right.
Then the question is, well, these housing solutions are not inexpensive, so why do we want to leave our house vacant? That's always a terrible idea. And often seniors don't want to play landlord because there's obligations.
That's a lot of work. Yeah, it is.
Stress that goes into that. And so they often just say, well, let's sell it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that may be a way to pump in a little more sellers into the market over the next several months. And if people are looking to upgrade, another thing it made me think of, talk to a lot of my friends that are in the family law space, and they're just counting the money before it happens on everybody that's going to get divorced after having to spend copious amounts of time at home with their spouse. And
terrible when you think about it.
Maybe really a buying opportunity where now both spouses need a house when it used to only be one house for both. So we might be able to find some additional sellers, additional buyers. I guess the final thoughts are, is it accurate to say that if there is a downturn in the housing market with respect to values, that it's not going to be similar to the 2008 downturn, because systematically they come from different places.
Right.
One is an artificial overvaluation. The other was maybe a little high, but not horrible. And then this medical issue, as you mentioned, that has driven things into a pause.
You know, I have a hard time comparing the two because they're two different. There's two different reasons why a downturn happened. You know, if a 2008 downturn is completely different than our current downturn. Our current downturn is, and it's not even really a downturn. If it is, it very well may be. We haven't seen it yet. But what I want you all to keep in mind, and something that we should all remember, is that if you purchased a property in 2006 at the height of the market, for example, and you held that property through today, how much did you actually lose? You know, the property values have recovered. So if you're planning on owning the property on a long-term basis, I would not worry myself all that much about your day-to-day fluctuations. You know, if you're holding it and you're living in it, then you just may end up living in it for a few more years, or you may end up renting it out for a couple of years. That being the case, you know, trying to time the market, I understand where you're coming from, because nobody wants to lose. You know, the fear of loss is greater than the potential for reward. You know, and that's just a normal human psychological trait. But if you hold a piece of property through a downturn, the loss is you only incur the loss if you sell at a loss.
Sure. Yeah, we call them in the stock industry. You know, we call them paper losses.
Right.
Where you haven't recognized it, and as long as you hold it long enough to rebound and hope it does rebound, then it works out. And unlike stocks, you know, real property, the company behind the real property doesn't go bankrupt and it goes to zero.
That's right.
It will always be worth something, even if it's the dirt value, but your real property investment will never go to zero.
Correct. And it's an asset that you can rent. So I mean, you can always generate income with it during that hold period. You know, real estate is probably the best multifaceted asset class on the planet. You know, it gives you great ability to leverage. It gives you the ability for tax savings. It gives you the ability to rent, you know, produce income, gives you capital appreciation. There's lots of reasons to own it. So if the market has a downturn, consider buying more. That's just my opinion. I put my money where my mouth is. We're still looking for opportunities in good times and in bad. You know, there's always an opportunity. If the numbers make sense, it makes sense.
Very cool. Well, listen, Sam, thank you so much for your time today. I know our viewers really appreciate your insight and expertise into your market. Very different from what we do, but really at the end of the day, they're all interrelated.
Yes, they are.
Especially with real property, it really touches every facet of life, because as long as you are alive, you need to live somewhere. And then the choices become, are we renting or buying or moving in with family? Like, all of those are options, but everything in life touches property and housing and structures. And
Absolutely.
So you're very much a wealth of knowledge. Appreciate you, and stay safe. Have a great weekend. Tell Winnie we said hello, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Take care.